join all of you at Health Analytics Asia. It's really wonderful to be brought to some of the terrific doctors in India, and so thank you for taking the time to join me. Today I'm going to talk about 10 myths about generic drugs, and this is based on my book, Bottle of Lies. What you see here is the image of the Indian edition. It's the same as the American edition. It just has a different cover and a different subtitle, Ranbaxy and the Dark Side of Indian Pharma. So this is the book that is widely available in India, available on Amazon India, or wherever books are sold. The book is based on 10 years of reporting on 4 continents, which include India, interviews with over 240 people, including numerous whistleblowers, over 20,000 pages of internal FDA documents, and that's US FDA, thousands of pages of internal corporate records from a number of generic drug companies, and that includes Indian companies, 16 Freedom of Information requests. So that's, we can request information through a law called FOIA, Freedom of Information, and I think you have something similar in India, and numerous magazine articles along the way. Just talk a little bit about the origin of the book, why I began reporting. In 2008, I got a phone call from a radio show host. It's a program in the US called The People's Pharmacy. And the host, Joe Graydon, said that patients had been calling into his program and complaining about their generic drugs, saying that they were having side effects or there was lack of effect from their drugs. And this is at a point when they were going into pharmacies and maybe they were on the brand version and they got switched to the generic version. And he asked a question to me, what is wrong with the drugs? So that is what propelled me to begin reporting. I'll talk a little bit about the reporting journey, but mostly I'm going to do it as these myths. So what our US FDA tells our doctors is that there is no difference between the brand and the generic, that they're identical, and that once the FDA has approved them, they are clinically equivalent, therapeutically equivalent. That's not exactly true. So in the US, our FDA has a definition of bioequivalence, which is that the generic has to be absorbed into the bloodstream at a rate that is not more than, at a concentration, not a rate, at a concentration that is not more than 20% below or 25% above the absorption into the blood of the brand name drug. Now, if you think about that, that is a fairly wide range, especially for what we call narrow therapeutic index drugs. So those are drugs where precise dosing is really important. So for neurology drugs, psychiatry drugs, cardiology drugs, those are all specialties where precise dosing of drugs is very important. And additionally to that, the medicine can have different ingredients and be absorbed at a different rate. And when I was reporting on this, the president of the American Psychiatric Association told me, the FDA is satisfied that generics are okay. My question is, are we satisfied? Now, the next slide, this rate is even, this absorption parameter is even bigger in India. So the CDSCO, in 2017, they passed a new regulation which says the generic cannot be more than 30% below or 30% above the concentration in the blood of the brand name. But they haven't even implemented that standard yet. So at the moment, there is no particular standard as I understand it. And similarly, the medicine can have different ingredients and be absorbed at a different rate. So, even if everything is going perfectly and the generic company is making the drug according to regulation, there is a very wide spectrum, both in the US and in India. So what, another issue, so our US FDA has said that there is no difference between different generic manufacturers. In other words, once the FDA approves it, you can switch between different generic versions and everything is fine. And my reporting has shown that that's not actually the case. So this gentleman you see here, Cedric Brown, got a heart transplant at the Cleveland Clinic. And he was fine and his recovery was going well, but his pharmacy then switched him from one generic tacrolimus to a different one made by Dr. Reddy's laboratory. And he suffered organ rejection and was back in the hospital with symptoms of rejection of his transplanted heart. Now, what's interesting is that the Cleveland Clinic doctors were not the only doctors in the US that had problem with the Dr. Reddy's version of tacrolimus. And I found that in 2013, a pharmacist at Loma Linda University Medical Center in California reported similar findings to the FDA. This is an adverse event filing with the FDA. And if you see what this pharmacist wrote, it has been noted in multiple patients at Loma Linda University Medical Center that patients using the Dr. Reddy's brand of Prograf, which is the brand name, have had unpredictable levels leading to inadequate immunosuppression and subsequent transplant failure. This has only been seen with Dr. Reddy's brand of Prograf. So, it is hard to say exactly what was wrong with that drug, but doctors definitely found that their patients were suffering a reaction to it, a negative reaction. Okay. Myth number 3, that the US FDA has flawless standards. And, any regulatory system on paper is only as good as its implementation. So, regulators can point to their own standards and say, we have a rigorous set of standards, but it's only as good as the implementation of those standards. So when I started investigating the US FDA and its own implementation of its standards, here's what I found. The FDA is regulating generic drug companies essentially on an honor system. So it is reviewing company-generated data. This is the bioequivalence data and testing data submitted by the companies, but it is not actually testing the drugs. So if the data looks good, the drugs are going to get approved. But that doesn't mean, but what if the data isn't good? And we'll get to that in a second. So when the FDA investigators inspect plants in the US, they show up unannounced. But overseas, the FDA is giving its inspections, notifying the plants that it's inspecting in advance. It's giving plants months of advance notice. And I'm sure any of you who have ever given a dinner party know that if your guests showed up unannounced, your house would not look as good as if you planned the dinner party, had advance notice, and cleaned up your house, which is essentially the same principle for these manufacturing plants. When I was reporting and I went down to the FDA and I talked to officials there, the head of the FDA's Office of Generic Drugs had this to say to me: the approval system requires the ethical behavior of the applicant. Otherwise, the whole house of cards will fall down, which is really a remarkable statement. I mean, they are acknowledging that they are regulating on an honor system. Okay, so now this is very interesting. So in terms of the FDA having flawless standards, when the FDA's sent a new director to run its India office, and that was in 2013. That director wrote a memo back to his superiors in the US. And basically, he noted the following problems with the Indian generic companies. He found that they were choosing not to follow regulations and requirements for a number of reasons. Number one was failure to invest and spend the necessary resources to guarantee a safe product. Another point that he highlighted was a rush to market mentality, which led to a failure to perform sufficient development studies prior to launch of the drug. Number three, a callousness by high-level officials of firms toward following regulations and requirements. But the fourth, and this was very interesting, was that the plants had acquired skills to prepare for inspections because the FDA was giving advance notice. So again, they've acquired skills to circumvent the regulations because they could conceal it in advance of inspections. Okay, so myth number 4, generic drug makers follow strict rules. So there's strict rules that are on the books, but do they follow them? And this was an email that I got from a confidential source who contacted me and began to explain to me, and this was back in 2009 when I first started my reporting, what was happening in these Indian plants. And as you can see, that anonymous person was calling themselves $4 refill, which is the amount that you would pay at a big commercial pharmacy like a Walmart if you went to refill a generic prescription. So here are some of, following this person's lead, here are some of the things I learned. So first of all, I began to hear about a company that I had never heard of before, but you all knew of, and that was a household name, which was Ranbaxy, which was at the time India's largest drug company. And it was actually, at that time, it was the fastest growing generic drug company in the US. So there is a standard process for developing a generic drug. And this is basically a map of how you do it if you're applying for the US market. So process for ANDA development. ANDA is abbreviated new drug application, and that's what you file with the FDA when you want permission to launch a generic drug. So you have to go through all these stages, and what they essentially mean is you're starting with small, you develop your product, you start with small batches, pilot batches in a laboratory. Though the data from pilot batches tends to look pretty good because you can control the manufacturing. But what happens is, as you scale up manufacturing and the runs of those pills or capsules gets bigger and bigger, the data gets harder to control because you're moving from the laboratory to the manufacturing floor. So you make exhibit batches, and then you make commercial batches, and then you file your ANDA. So the company Ranbaxy figured out that they could, if they eliminated later testing, and they could make the little batches like bioequivalent, the pilot batches look like commercial batches, and file that successful data with the FDA, and they would not only speed up the time to market, speed up the filing of their ANDA, but the data would look better. So there was data fraud occurring inside Ranbaxy. And we're going to get to the question of, was Ranbaxy the only company that did this or not? But just going along, some of you may have heard that there was a what I call a smoking gun document inside of Ranbaxy, which was a PowerPoint that was shown to the board of directors of the company, which they showed it in 2004. And that PowerPoint, which was based on internal research, showed that there were elements of data that were fabricated to support business needs. and that data fraud affected more than 200 products in more than 40 countries, which is really incredible. That is essentially evidence of a global crime, that they had filed applications with regulators all over the world and had faked their data. And what happened inside Ranbaxy, and it's a story that I tell in great detail in the book, is that the company asked, once this was presented to the board of directors, the response was, can we destroy this PowerPoint, and why don't we destroy the laptop on which it was created as well? And of course, the PowerPoint didn't get destroyed, because here it is in my slide presentation and in my book as well. Myth number 5, the FDA conducts rigorous inspections. So as we talked about before, they are pre-announced weeks and sometimes months in advance, whereas in the US, the inspections are unannounced. Diplomacy trumps public health. So what I mean by that is because the US FDA is afraid of an international incident, they will often pull their punches overseas. They will not inspect as rigorously because they want to make sure that they don't anger the Indian government, the Chinese government. So really that compromises public health. The inspections are staged, which means that, as I say below, the plants operate data falsification teams. They know when the FDA is coming. They send in teams of 20 or more people. They fabricate documents, shred them, alter them in advance of inspections. And the end result of this is that these pre-announced inspections also have a corrupting effect on our own investigators. What do I mean by that? One of my sources put it to me that what is going on is regulatory tourism. So the plants know when they're coming. The FDA actually asks them whether they can arrange ground transportation and whether they can arrange hotel rooms for the inspectors. So what do you think happens? Our inspectors are given a 5-star treatment. They are met with luxury vehicles at the airports. Their hotel rooms are magically upgraded and they never see a bill. There are shopping trips, massages, and golf outings. There are trips to the Taj Mahal, and I am all in favor of trips to the Taj Mahal because it is one of the greatest sights I've ever seen, but I don't think that they should be provided for free to our FDA investigators. And also offers of gifts like gold coins. And all of this is documented in my book. Here's what this looks like, okay, this pre-announced inspection. What's striking about this is an email that was sent by an FDA investigator to a Ranbaxy plant, okay? The date is 2010. The reason that's significant is because at that point, Ranbaxy had been under criminal investigation by the FDA for 5 years. And even when under criminal investigation, what is the FDA asking? It's saying, can you accommodate us for an inspection 2 months from now, right? August 19th is the date of the email, but the visit is October 4th to 8th. Can you arrange lodging accommodations and availability to assist with round-trip transportation? Okay, so we're still asking to be guests at the plant 5 years into a criminal investigation. Kind of amazing. So we talked about an honor system of inspection, and that to me is a really good example of that. Okay, myth number 6. That generic companies maintain one global standard. So this would be, take any of your big companies that export all over the world. You would assume that a drug is a drug, right? If you're going to get Lipitor in the US, or you're going to buy it in India, or you're going to buy it in Sri Lanka or Vietnam, that it would be the same anywhere you pick up that tablet from the same manufacturer. That is not true. What happens is that these companies alter the quality of their drug depending on what market they're exporting it into. So the less vigilant the regulator in any given country, the worse the drugs are. So I have, say here, worse drugs for what are called ROW markets. Those are known in the industry as rest of world markets. So for example, India is considered a rest of world market, which means that even your own companies are sending worse drugs into the Indian market than they are sending into the US market. They are often made in different plants. It's the same company, but those may be different plants. Now, the images you see here, so let me just say that the manufacturing standard ends up being whatever they can get away with, right? If they're sending it into markets where they think the regulators are asleep, the drugs are worse. This is a big, these images here are from a big exporting company. I'm not going to say which one. It's a big international company with manufacturing plants in India. And these are the plants where they are making drugs for the African market. Okay, and what are we seeing here? Well, there is a lovely, charming visitor of a monkey who is right next to these bins of active pharmaceutical ingredient. So the blue bins are supposed to be sterile. They're covered with dirt, and we've got, I love monkeys, love them, but in a sterile manufacturing plant, not as much. And then below, what you're seeing there, those again are containers of active ingredient covered with pigeon droppings. Okay, so this is clearly not a plant that is not operating with sterile conditions.
Katherine, you got 5 more minutes.
Okay, this quote down here, this was from a conference call inside of Ranbaxy when a senior scientist on the call asked her colleagues, she was concerned about the quality of the HIV drugs in Africa, and the Ranbaxy's medical director said, "Who cares, it's just blacks dying." So the attitude is cavalier towards these rest of world markets. Okay, well, let's talk about some myths about Bottle of Lies, because there's been a lot of controversy around the book. So one way that the generic drug industry has hit back against the book is to make the claim that it's based on outdated information, that it only tells the story of Ranbaxy, which is not true. The book follows a FDA investigator named Peter Baker, who and follows him actually all the way through 2018. But it tells the story of the 86 inspections that he did between 2012 and 2016 in India and China. He found elements of data fraud in 4/5 of those manufacturing plants. The industry has also claimed that data fraud is in the past and it doesn't occur anymore, which is also not true. So I just last week published an analysis of data from FDA inspections up to the present, and found that data falsification in generic drug plants in China and India is still a huge problem. You can see the quote there: "Egregious data integrity violations are alive and well, especially in China and India. The rate at plants in the US is a lot lower." And just for example, a January 2019 inspection at Indoco Remedies in Goa found that the manufacturing plant had faked data in its batch production record to get a diabetes drug onto the market when it did not pass specifications. So basically, what the book uncovers and tells the story of is generic companies that are making drugs without GMP practices, good manufacturing practices, and selling them at GMP prices, undercutting their own products for profit, using hidden laboratories throughout the plants to to secretly pre-test the drugs and then alter the parameters to pass the drugs. And I'm going to next, and submitting all that data to regulators to gain market approval. This is a picture of one of those hidden laboratories, which the US FDA uncovered at a plant in Mohali, India, where they were pre-testing drugs. And as you can see, it is also doesn't appear to be sterile. Myth number 9, that Bottle of Lies is an India-bashing book. And I would just point out to you, the heroes of the book are Indian. This is a whistleblower, Dinesh Thakur, who blew the whistle on Ranbaxy. And this is a email that he wrote to the head of the US FDA, pleading with him to stop the global crime at Ranbaxy. And finally, because I know time is short, that Bottle of Lies is one-sided and irresponsible. So, for example, the managing director of Lupin had this to say about the book. I haven't read it at all, but know enough about it. I think this is taking a bunch of historic events. It's very one-sided. Well, he hasn't even read the book and he's making that claim. But the fact is that every company that is named in the book and every individual was given an opportunity to respond. The book has 40 pages of endnotes, which explain exactly where I got the information in it. Every invented claim is substantiated in the book, and it has been rigorously fact-checked. So those are 10 myths, and I think, are we doing a little bit of Q&A, Syed?
Yeah, I think if there are questions, we will certainly have 1 or 2 questions.
Okay.
Yeah. If anybody has a question.
Okay.
So anybody has questions for Katherine? You?
You mentioned one case of tacrolimus from Dr. Reddy's showing adverse effects. Considering the fact that India is supplying almost 1/3 of the generic drugs to the US market, is there documentation of adverse side effects encountered by those using drugs from Indian generic companies?
That is an excellent question. So I spent a lot of time looking for data, and the problem right now is that there are no big longitudinal studies, and that data on adverse effects or lack of effect is not being systematically gathered and needs to be. We need to do those studies. So what we have is clear data on fraud in plants, and we also have a lot of anecdotal data from doctors and patients. So for example, the findings of doctors at the Cleveland Clinic, test results for individual patients, which show change in condition or inability of doctors to control symptoms once switches take place from brand to generic. But the big studies that would give us more comprehensive data have not been done. They just haven't been done, and they need to be.
So your book is absolutely fascinating, and while you did talk about the response in India to your book, and incidentally this morning I was talking about a WhatsApp message that was also circulating. I don't know if you saw that. It was called Vial of Truth and Bottle of Lies or something like that, with all kinds of allegations. But I just want to know, how did the US FDA respond to your book?
Well, sort of in 2 ways. So the book came out on the 14th of May, and on the 13th of May, so 1 day before, the FDA released a lot of material about why their system of inspections is so terrific and effective. So it was a kind of, pre-messaging battle. And the FDA has continued to insist that its systems are effective, but there are now, partly on the basis of the book, there are now congressional investigations taking place. So the FDA officials are being asked to testify and comment. And pretty much the history of the US FDA is that they really insist everything is fine until they acknowledge that it's not. And then that's how changes get made. So, they are still in the phase of insisting everything is fine. But it is clear that, there are signs that they are absorbing what is a growing chorus of criticism about how they're doing inspection.
Any other question? One question. We've got one more question, Katherine.
Hi, Katherine. I just have one question with a couple of parts. The question is about, the two things with misinformation, the origin and spread of misinformation. On a more, one part is on the more you and me sort of retail scale. And the second one is corporate messaging around misinformation. Some companies have been totally egregious. For instance, say Purdue with opioid products. If you could take us through, the contours or any patterns that you've seen with regard to the more retail scale and corporate messaging side of things in more developed markets, spread of misinformation.
Syed, would you mind repeating the question?
If it's been short, I'm really not able to get it, what the question is.
Sure. If you could take us through any patterns that you've seen in, developed markets with regard to origin and spread of misinformation. Firstly, on the retail sort of you and me side of things, like between people, and secondly, on the corporate messaging about different products. If you could tell us a little bit about any patterns that you've seen emerge with regard to misinformation.
You mean to say generic drugs?
Not just generic drugs, actually.
Overall. Okay.
Spread of
Okay.
medical misinformation.
How do you see
patterns that you've seen?
Katherine, how do you see medical misinformation spreading, including say drugs and other stuff? So,
yeah. So you mean like in the U.S., for example?
Yeah, generally.
U.S. and generally more developed markets.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of ways that medical misinformation spreads. I mean, one is that the companies themselves spread misinformation. So, for example, our tremendous opioid crisis, that in a way, what ignited that crisis was the false claim by the company Purdue Pharma that their opioid OxyContin was not addictive, that it was much less addictive than other opioids, and that was completely false. And because the Purdue Pharma lobbied the FDA, they got permission to expand the usage of that drug. So suddenly a drug that was mostly just prescribed by oncologists and people, who were treating late stage cancer, suddenly the indication was expanded for just, regular internists who were treating patients with back pain. So that's an example in which the companies themselves spread misinformation. And I think that's, a pretty significant way that it does spread. Just another way that company spread it is they created these phony patient groups. These, we call them AstroTurf, but it's basically front groups that look like patients, and they made this claim that pain was an untreated epidemic in the U.S., and that was to further drive prescriptions. So I would say that's a big way that fake information spreads.